Welcome to Future Left Podcast. I'm Adam Simpson, here as always with Casey Rogers. Casey, how you doing today?
Doing good, man. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. Future Left Podcast, where we talk about a progressive future. We're talking today about the future according to women. What would happen if we purposely built a view of the future curated entirely from the perspective of women? We're joined today by the editor of the Future According to Women, Miss Emily Empel. Emily, welcome to the Future Left Podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get started, just go over a few things. You can, of course, reach us at www.futureleft.org. You can send me and Casey emails, adam@futureleft.org, casey@futureleft.org, and follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, all that stuff. And also you can follow Emily on Twitter at localrat. Best Twitter handle I ever heard so far. She is a futurist at Idea Couture, and of course, as I mentioned, the editor of Misc Magazine's The Future According to Women. Misc Magazine, a journal for insight and foresight. So I think before we get started, we have to address the elephant in the room that is fast stampeding toward the White House. It's something, because me and Casey are obviously from Texas, rural folk who overwhelmingly voted for Trump. Casey, I would have
voted for Trump. That's not what he meant to say.
Yeah. Certainly we didn't. No. I guess I'm concerned. I would have thought that, someone who brags about sexual assault and someone who has been accused so many times of sexual assault, that would have been a red line for a lot of quote unquote our people, Southern folk. You'd think that'd be a big deal. Apparently not. But Emily, I'm wondering.
Values.
Yeah, Emily, I'm wondering how have you been feeling about the election since we elected this guy?
Yeah, so Adam, I'm actually now based in Canada, so it was especially weird for me.
Sorry about that.
You did it,
yeah,
huh? You did it.
You're
huh?
right.
Were you
Honestly,
there before the election?
I was there before the election, and it's a great place. But it's odd, kind of looking almost as an outsider as to what's been happening in the U.S. for over the past year. And I think this was especially disheartening when we think about the outcome. In what I do in professional foresight, there's something we normally do with our clients, which is get a sense of their baseline future. So get a sense of how they see the future today or how they really think about time. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Zimbardo's time theory. So Zimbardo's theory, which is that we all have a sense of time. So some people might be really prone to see the future as a positive space or the present as the space they want to inhabit. And I think what's interesting in Donald Trump is that he was really able to get a sense of the time orientation of some people in the United States, which is a really past positive time orientation, and kind of position his messaging comm strategy for that orientation, which is obviously really scary because we can't go back to the past, right? The future's being reinvented.
I think me and Adam did mention in a podcast we did one time on the quote unquote frustrated white working class that it seems like there's a large segment of the white working class that views the future and even their present in very negative terms. While people in historically marginalized communities who are seeing, it seems weird saying they're seeing improvement, but I guess because there's only room for improvement in a lot of these communities, they tend to be a lot more positive about their future, and that leads to a lot of anger within the white working class population. Isn't that what we read, Adam? Wasn't that from a
Yeah, we did an episode about the white working class, and honestly, I guess I'm still a little bit angry. I feel like I've seen so many think pieces about the white working class and about why, what's making, white men in particular very, very angry. And I'm just over it. I don't know. You know what I mean? It's like constantly like, trade this. They don't. And I feel like we're dancing around the fact that misogyny and racism is at least some part of it, but yeah. All right. But it's been a week since the election when we're recording this. I do. Obviously, we're more concerned about the future here. I don't want to get too pessimistic by thinking about Trump. So I'd like to get right into discussing the future according to women. So Emily, I'm wondering, if, in your own words, could you tell us what the future of according to women is about, obvious though it may be, and kind of what the process was like that led to this initiative, and what was the thinking behind it?
Yeah, so I'm a futurist and I have been for quite some time. And it's a space that's primarily dominated by men, or at least the visions that we read about the future are dominated by oftentimes white men. So we could think of the Elon Musks and the Sergey Brins of the world, the Ray Kurzweils, who are kind of peddling this view of the future that we see across all types of media that we're reading. So I was approached by Misk Magazine. I work at Idea Couture. They have a partnership with a magazine that's really focused on thinking about the future, and they wanted to do an issue about women. And in thinking about guest editing this issue, I really wanted to focus on the future, obviously. And I thought it would be really interesting to actually do a piece where we gather the perspectives of a disparate set of women and see where that leads us. So, not really going from a feminist perspective, but more understanding what certain women feel about the future of X and kind of piecing that together into some sort of picture of the future. And so we started this project, and I thought maybe we would have like 5 to 7 women respond. And the response was overwhelming. So we ended up interviewing over 40 women for the piece. We got a lot of cool emails, like my email that I want to frame. We got an email from Ruth Bader Ginsburg from her people saying that she was so excited about the project, but obviously couldn't participate. So it was just very interesting to have all these discussions with all these women who don't get asked often enough how they think about the future, and what that space means to them.
So, kind of when I was reading this, you talked about Ray Kurzweil and Elon Musk. I guess what I took away from the opening is that the project isn't necessarily about how women exclusively or specifically would change the future, but just getting a baseline. How do they imagine it? Is that correct?
That is correct. So rather than approach someone and talk about how women will change the future of security or how women will change the future of food, we just approach women and ask them what the future of food or security might look like. Um, Kind of keeping the space open to see whether the perspective that we gathered from all these women would be different from what we're reading every day.
Right, right. No, it's an interesting distinction. I guess how what do you think is the advantage of that distinction? Because I sense advantages, but I'm wondering if you could articulate them better than I.
I think we really first kept in mind our readership, and our readership, we're not a certain type of magazine. We're Misk Magazine, which appeals to a business audience. And while I think those publications are really important, we wanted broad application from the content that can be used basically by everyone. Like anyone can read this piece and gather something valuable from it, which is really cool. And the other thing is, it really hasn't been done before. So there are certain publications that have come out that have gathered a feminist view of the future. There's a really great project. It's called the Feminist Utopia Project. I would highly recommend having the curator on the podcast at some point. But they've done it. They've talked to people and said, what if we built a feminist utopia? What would that look like? So the space has been done before. We were looking at the people that we think about as thought leaders who are women. What are they thinking about the future, and why aren't we asking them?
So the document obviously covers a lot of ground, from security to gaming to entrepreneurship, space exploration, sustainability, all different kinds of fields. What were some of your favorite insights that you received, and that you would hope to highlight for people to take away from this?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the actual document. So what we did is we did all these interviews. We had 40 interviews, and originally we were just going to publish a series of interviews. And when we looked at all the content we had, it didn't really make sense. It made more sense to kind of piece them together into scenarios for the future. So the way that the future according to women is organized is actually by 5 thematic areas. And so the one that I ended up working the most on was something called Virtual First. In that chapter, we interviewed Cindy Gallup on the future of sex. We interviewed Nancy Jo Sales on the future of girlhood. And we also interviewed Jen Richards on the future of gender. So we interviewed all these women that if you probably got them in the same room together, it would be very heated discussion and dialogue, different points of view. Cindy Gallup runs a site called Make Love Not Porn. And her idea is that talking about sex in a real and authentic way is the way towards world peace. So she thinks that a lot of our fundamental issues as a society come from how we view sex. Nancy Jo Sales has looked at the experience of girlhood and how technology has really influenced this experience and put a lot of power in the hands of boys. So we kind of mashed up all of these insights from these women, and we ended up coming up with a scenario or a space for exploration, which we called Virtual First. And it was around the idea of using VR as a safe space for exploring really broad issues that you might face as a young girl or boy growing up. In our case, we looked at body issues and how VR can be used to promote more positive realities for women going through puberty.
Yeah, the structure is really jumped out at me. I thought it was really interesting because there's like almost short stories, science fiction short stories at the end of each section. Did you write those, or did
I did? Yeah, so I worked with an amazing team on this. I worked with 3 other women, Mira, Esther, and Ashley. We all work together. And that's really what we do in Futures or strategic foresight is we gather all this data. In this case, it was interviews about the future. And then we kind of piece them together into what this might mean. And oftentimes that comes forward in the format of scenarios. And exactly as you mentioned, they're kind of speculative fictions. So whether we're dealing with clients... Exactly. It's what does this all mean, and what would it feel like to live in this future? And we weren't really doing this to present a vision of the future or the future we want to live in. It was more to present almost a provocation to ask people, like, is this what you want? If not, what would you want instead?
Well, I know that me and Casey had some favorite sections as well. I think we both really liked the future of gaming because me and Casey are both big nerds, and but the thing I picked up on, and I can't, it hasn't left me yet, is the kind of way video games are set up, and kind of individualism as patriarchy is what Mary Flanagan talked about. And I think it's like, Casey, I don't know how you feel, but like it's always been kind of a shortcoming to me in a lot of narrative spaces in video games. I think she says even like we have to kind of take off the superhero cape when we're imagining like our interaction with these virtual worlds. She
says we have to get out of superhero mode if we're going to kind of deal with all the humongous issues that we face as a society right now, which, going back to what you said originally, is really interesting when we think about someone like Donald Trump, who is this individual problem solver, or as he positions himself.
Right. He's the new decider. Yeah.
Well, that element of it sort of, I had to sort of reorient myself towards it, because on a strictly gaming level, I'm very selfish when it comes to playing video games. I don't like playing online. I don't like sharing my video game experience with other people. I very much like me being one character who does something, but then I never thought about the implications. I never thought about the subtext there, and so that was something that I really had to step back and take a look at, and it was very interesting.
Well, it's something I've noticed as well, is that a lot of times you're playing a video game and you get the feeling like the world really doesn't move unless you move it, and it's always it feels like it, and when it's bad enough to notice, it really takes you out of the video game. But most of them are set up like that nothing happens in this entire universe. No, like you have people like, can you go fetch this item for me? And you're like, no one. Like the guy that kills the dragon also has to fetch the thing. Well, why? What is this?
Or you go into a room and you get the feeling that everybody has just started moving and doing stuff as soon as you go into the room, and you leave the room and you come back in and they're all in the exact same starting place again.
Yeah.
Like,
no, I thought that was
in this video game. It's not making a sound if I'm not around.
Right. I thought that was particularly fascinating. because of the too many hours, we'll say, that I've spent playing video games.
And Mary talked this, actually we didn't put it in the magazine, but it's still really interesting. She talked about how different types of politicians are using game rules to expand how they're targeting their constituents and driving social change. And she talked about I think he's a mayor in Colombia, and what he did is he hired mimes in the streets to drive new behaviors. So there was a lot of gridlock, like unsafe driving. So instead of just thinking about policies, the types of policies he can put in place, he actually went back to the drawing board and wondered, what if we employ mimes to actually shame people? Would that drive different behaviors?
Oh my God. So what you get is less traffic, more nightmares. That's pretty.
Yeah. Oh, definitely more nightmares.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think Mary mentioned that she's going to be coming out with a book that takes this idea of really moving from individual superhero mode to collective superhero mode, and how that can be applied to other elements beyond just gaming.
I also Natalie Panic, her piece that was really much related to environmentalism. And correct me if I'm wrong, Natalie Panic works on robotics in space, particularly. And I would have never guessed that an article that kind of talked about space would make me kind of rethink environmentalism on Earth, which I thought was really fascinating. But I really enjoyed that piece. She was talking about how we kind of stop polluting space, which was kind of mind blowing for me, because it's the kind of thing, I know there's a bunch of crap up there, but it took this to make me realize it was kind of, yeah, it's a problem that we just got a bunch of things floating in the atmosphere for no particular reason.
Yeah, and she equated the idea, or she equated leave no trace to how that can manifest in space. So her idea was in servicing satellites, that it might make sense for individuals or organizations to actually put down a deposit that they only get back if they return the satellite from space to Earth. So super interesting ways of kind of solving for these issues.
Right. And it's the kind of thing you hear about in a lot of other scenarios. Like, you're supposed to care for this thing from cradle to the grave. Like, you don't just insert something into the environment, into the earth, and then, or into the environment. We'll leave it at that. And then just be like, well, I'm done now. Now everyone pay me for my service. You have to maintain it. You have to make sure it doesn't harm other perhaps future satellites and the obviously limited space we have in our direct orbit. Obviously, space. I'm not a smart man. I don't know if it's infinite or what the debate is there anymore. But I don't know. It was really fascinating to have that applied to space, and thinking of that more on Earth.
Well, and it would make sense also that people that work in space would have a different perspective on the fragility of the Earth and the necessity of taking care of it. I've heard so many astronauts, some of the early Apollo astronauts, who said on the approach back home, they're so happy to see Earth, and they're so, they've been out there and they look down this tiny blue marble, and they say it's incredible that everything you've ever cared about is contained on this little blue island of life in the middle of nothingness. And that's a perspective a lot of people are missing. We're notoriously short-sighted these days, and our scope is often falls very short.
And Natalie actually talks about the overview effect, and one of the things she mentioned was this idea: if you were able to recreate that experience of seeing Earth from space,
right,
for the majority of people living here, how would that change the way we interact with the natural world?
Right. I think it would change it incredibly.
We could hope, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of, like, because I guess the thing for me when I think about space, and like if I were an astronaut looking down on Earth, which is obviously not perhaps an experience that's difficult to fully understand, but the thing I take away from space is that death is always everywhere around you, because we're not meant to be there.
Metaphorically as well too, because it's just black and empty.
Yeah. But so that's always what I take away from, like, I don't know, obviously it is wondrous, but it seems like it's just you're surrounded by challenges and threats and perhaps crises of all different kinds, and I think it does give you an appreciation for the safety, certainly the relative safety of being grounded on Earth.
So another piece that I greatly enjoyed was by Adrienne Marie Brown, and talking about visionary fiction, and she was talking about how important it is for communities and peoples that have historically had their voices stifled and have historically been marginalized in their ability to sort of contribute to the mainstream cultural production in our society, how important it is for them to have these outlets into our fiction and to sort of create their visions of a future, and that the more diversity there is in voices that are painting these pictures of the future, it's sort of the argument that the more voices there are in a conversation, the more complete a solution will find. And I found it very compelling.
Yeah, I love talking with Adrienne Marie Brown. I thought it was a really important conversation. She mentioned this one line, and it really stuck with me. She said something like, right now, police officer can imagine that young, unarmed Black person is dangerous and can shoot them with impunity. And she called this an act of our imagination, and the work of visionary fiction to challenge that and really create these new paradigms from the bottom up instead of top down, which is what we're used to. As someone else we spoke with, Sharon Burke, we interviewed her on the future of security, and I just asked her point blank whether she sees the future differently than her male colleagues. And she told me no, that a lot of what they saw was very much aligned, but she equated it more to the fact that you're missing 50% of the population. So you're missing a lot of voices. They aren't necessarily distinctly different all the time from a male perspective, but it's really important to include them nevertheless to get that holistic picture, make sure you're not missing any of these opportunities.
And I think the notion that there's as a white man, or a whitish man myself, I'm actually biracial, but in our society I get to be white. I get to be a white man in our society. I find it. I think it's difficult for a lot of white men to recognize just how different the experience of our sort of shared reality is for other people in other segments of the population, and a lot of that is coming out now, and it's you can see it when there's so many white men on the internet saying, "Oh my God, everybody stop making a big deal about it. There's nothing to be afraid of. I'm not afraid." In these last few days, I've been thinking, "Oh, thank God the white men aren't afraid to live in Donald Trump's America." They can't wrap their minds around why people would be afraid, and there's such that shows that there is a gap in our experiences.
Yeah, I think part of it is I think there's something about the human experience that we're biased to think that our challenges are the ones that are most monumental. Even Absolutely. People I deeply care about. If there are people that I'll talk to and tell man, I had a really rough day, and they'll be like, "You had a rough day. Listen to what I went through." And I'm like, "Okay, all right, it's fine too." But I think
we do that as a people too. Whenever we look at people who are on welfare, and we paint them as if, they're just living the life, and they're really getting one over on us. These people on welfare. It's mind blowing. They really act like they're being taken advantage of by these people who have nothing.
Right, and kind of related to focusing on the bottom-up approach that Adrienne Marie Brown discusses, there were actually a lot of things in The Future According to Women that kind of addressed kind of systemic problems and systemic change. One example that I really enjoyed was from Aubrey Yee. She talking about the future of oceans, and she suggested when it comes to environmental degradation and responding to crisis, the underlying problem is how power is diffused and concentrated. And I'm wondering if you got a sense, and I'm thinking specifically of Adrienne Marie Brown, to be frank, about the bottom-up organizing, but did you get a sense of kind of models that we might think through in terms of how to reconsider social and political power? And I know that's a very broad question, and it's imagine the government of the future, but I guess that's To be fair, my new job, I'm working on something called the Next System Project. So systemic change is something I've been obsessed with lately. But I'm wondering if you got a sense of what the people you talk to and what you yourself imagine in terms of system change.
I apologize for Adam name dropping the project he's working on, by the way. Continue.
All good here.
Yeah.
I think what my main takeaway was in doing this work is in all of our interviews, I would say every single one, the types of changes that these women were talking about happened at the systems level, and their preferred futures would be impacting how we think about politics and governance. It would be impacting the way we organize socially. It would be impacting our economic structure. So really thinking beyond technology. I would say that is every single interview we did. The interview that really stood out to me the most in this space was with Amina Wadood. She's an Islamic scholar, and we talked to her on the future of identity, and she went like all over the place. It was one of the most incredible conversations I've had. I still listen to it, actually, the full recording. I can't wait until we publish the full interview on misc.com. But she talks about the idea of patriarchy and how patriarchy is this mode of conquer and control that has really influenced all our organizing systems. And she talks about life beyond patriarchy. So if we want to have a sustainable long-term future on Earth, what does that look like? What needs to change? And the two things that she mentioned, one is the notion of a transgender God, which is really, really interesting. Is she didn't go from one gender binary to the other. She didn't go from the patriarchy to this goddess figure, but she talks about a God that fulfills the needs for individuals in all different types of gender locations, which is super profound. And then the other point she mentions is just the idea of money and currency, and how the systems that we kind of operate in are about gaining more money to gain more power. But once you gain all this money and power, what happens? And she talks about the ultra rich elite, the Bill Gates of the world, who are able to kind of gather all of these resources, and then they put them back into making the system better, but the system's still the same, right? So I think she had some of the more interesting thoughts there. The other section that I thought really addressed this, we had a whole chapter called Parent Relations that was just talking about reimagining the workplace, and what happens if you really consider the act of care as something equivalent and valued to kind of paid labor. What does that look like? So a lot of interviews with parents there on just how to reconsider child's care and how that fits in to the model of capitalism that we've built.
Right. The one thing I really wanted to pull out, and I think it was mentioned in one of the sections under quote our thinking, was about I think at one point you discussed you're running around in your self-driving cars and picking up a hamburger that's made in a laboratory rather than off a cow, and kind of the future becoming more artificial, and how we retain kind of a certain sense of humanity within it. And I was hoping you might elaborate on that idea and kind of what you took away in terms of that sort of concept.
Yeah, so this was another theme that resonated in a lot of the conversations, is just this idea that we're making things more technological, and we kind of have to in order to create a sustainable future, especially in something like the food space. And so what came from this is this idea of words for the unknown, so actually shaping language and innovation to be more human centered. One of the interesting conversations we had was with a woman. Her name is Abby Aspen Glencross, and she works for an organization that does cellular agriculture. And she talked about really defining what synthetic protein is. Doesn't have to do as much with the innovation and creating the thing as much as it has to do with shaping the language around how we think about synthetic food and proteins. So being really proactive in that space, to so we don't have the same issue that we've had with GMOs, right? Where we start to engage consumers from the beginning, or individuals from the beginning, to really help shape that space with the scientists who are working. The other conversation that I had, and this is something else, I'm just kind of feeding nuggets that weren't necessarily in the piece, hoping some stick. I chatted with a neuroscientist. Her name is Jillian Einstein, and she's engaged in something called situated neuroscience. And I asked her about the idea of the singularity. I was like, okay, what do you think about the singularity? Is this something you think about? What's your view? And so what she does is connect the endocrine system to the brain in her work. And her fear is that the singularity will only take into account the male brain and the dynamic between brain and bodily function in what it models, which I thought was really profound. It was just her kind of thinking on her feet also, which I found incredible.
What exactly do you mean? I'm sorry to interrupt, but like I don't. It's a little bit over my head. What do you mean by connecting the endocrine system to the brain? Do you mean that's literally she does surgery to connect people's endocrine systems to their brain?
No. So
okay.
It's a good question. Good. It's a good question.
I'm glad that's not what you meant.
So she looks at how the rest of the body influences the brain. So instead of looking at the brain as one system, she's looking at the body as a system. And her thinking is that the types of, let's say, sex organs that you have in men versus women, and hormones and things like that, creates a very different experience in the brain. And we need to understand both and be able to model those systems before we can reach some sort of singularity, let's say, or some sort of artificial modeling that is has some sort of gender parity to it.
So instead of looking at the brain as a sort of input monolith, it's looking at how the body, it's sort of looking at it as more of a dialectic, how the brain speaks to the body and the body speaks back to the mind, and how the particulars of your anatomy influence your brain. That's very interesting. I have to admit, I never thought about that. Whenever I think about, people becoming machines, I think brain in a machine, done. We'll be fine.
Yeah, it's the Matrix. Someone's puts a techno knife in your head, and then you're in the Matrix. Boom. Actually, there's this thing that keeps coming up in like transhumanist discussions about this about a head transplant, and the reason why people were skeptical that this could ever occur is because of that your brain is more than just a brain. You sew it onto something else and you're fine. The brain chemistry, they're like, even if someone survived it, which is doubtful, they'd go that psychosis would be the most likely outcome of such a procedure, for the exact reason of brain chemistry that can be so unique, and your brain gets so I guess acclimated to your own biochemistry. But I don't know why I decided to discuss head transplants, but
no, I think it's actually pretty relevant, is just the whole industry of cryonics.
Yeah.
And if this really is the case,
don't ruin cryonics for me.
Well, are you saving just your head, or are you saving the whole body?
I feel like you need to save the whole body. When I think about just saving the head, I'm like, that you're gonna wake up in some sort of hellish nightmare if you just save your head. Consciousness with no ability to influence the world around you, just in a jar like Futurama.
Yeah. A related note to your work on the future according to women. When I first tried to put together Future Left's Ask the Robot question Q&A, I gather all my books that I have on workforce automation because it's the thing that I'm most obsessed with, and that's when I first realized, like, man, I have a pretty glaring inclusivity gap when in the things that I've been reading and the things that I've been studying. And when I, even making the effort to put together the Ask the Robot question Q&A, making sure I had voices of women and people of color, because as you said at the beginning, I feel like this field, for whatever reason, is just so dominated by men. I felt like I was playing catch up on identifying, more voices to make this project more inclusive. And I think Casey, I think you'll agree, we pretty much failed on the inclusivity standard.
We absolutely failed. Yeah.
And so once, after volume 1 settled down, is actually when I found your work, and that's how because I was looking who is filling the space in terms of women, female futurists, and I get a sense, maybe this is a bit of a sidebar. I get a sense there's a difference between a futurist, someone who does the kind of work you do, and kind of quote unquote futurology, when people are like, you know, what if we could like modify our bodies with like you know, horns and like become like have a cyborg eye or something. I get a sense that always seems like a different thing.
Are you talking about a particular third-party presidential candidate?
I'm not meaning to give any shit to Zoltan Istvan.
With the name of a magician?
No, but I get a sense there's a difference between the kind of work thinking about the future and like one day we're gonna have tech that we can like change our body parts into machines and animals and stuff. Man, I always feel weird about disparaging them in the way that I just did. But
I was about to say, making him a hippie.
How do you distinguish?
I don't.
Yeah, but I'm wondering how you distinguish between like the futurism that you do and kind of the more what I will just say from my perspective is much more out there kind of future
armchair futurism.
Yeah, maybe that's what it should be called, armchair futurism.
Yeah. So I'm a practicing futurist, which essentially means I help companies think about their future. So they need sometimes to bring in some mercenaries to really help shake up thinking. And it's not about thinking about the future for the sake of thinking about the future. So coming up with like the craziest, wildest, weirdest stuff I can, or my team can. It's more about really getting a sense of how they think about the future today and then provoking that in a purposeful way to drive new opportunities for them. And I think what is interesting is that there are quite a few people who work in strategic foresight or are professional futurists around the globe. We often our views are owned by the organizations that we work with, and so the public views that we read about, which are the more out there. I don't know if out there is the right word.
Yeah,
but they're
figure out the best way to.
They're kind of like peddling the future for the sake of peddling a certain vision that they want to.
So it's like New York Times bestseller type of futurism.
Exactly.
Popular futurism, I guess, as opposed to scientific futurism.
That's exactly what we call it. Is pop futures in the professional foresight community. And so that's fine, right? Like you can be Ray Kurzweil and really want the singularity to happen. He's always the person I pick on because he's so well known. And that's totally fair, but I think the future always comes with a caveat, right? That the singularity isn't happening with certainty. It's can happen, but there are a lot of different alternatives, and I think responsible foresight is kind of setting up those alternatives for individuals instead of really sounding deterministic. I think that's my first caveat. And kind of disclosing the future that you want. Like my job is when I'm working with a client, I can't really want a particular future. I have to be pretty neutral in what I'm doing, or else I can't influence the organization.
Do you ever? Is it hard for you to watch science fiction? Because you're like, none of these things would exist in the same system.
Hard.
Like none of these would exist in the same reality. None of these different things. Who gets the closest? Who gets the closest to having a coherent? Like, what science fiction movie or series in your mind gets closest to having a coherent?
So this is it's pretty basic, but I'm going to use it anyway. I love Her. I think that is the logic doesn't line up for the future and where it lands. But at the time when I was watching Her, I was just so sick of like blue, silver, high tech futures, and
some lens flares.
The visual.
That's what George Lucas. Exactly. That's what George Lucas got right. George Lucas made a dirty future, and that's what everybody was like. What does he do? I want the ships to be rusted. I want things to be broken down. Sorry.
But that's so important. And when we work with our teams, that's what I'm always looking for. I'm like, one, who are these people in the future? Like they all look like us. We need to kind of challenge that assumption. And the future is going to be messy. Like
exactly.
It is. The present and the past were always messy. The future is going to be as well. And I think that's I think people are so obsessed with like the technology or the idea that they miss a lot of the social elements that
Right,
are
right.
changing.
I can't watch things about the future or science fiction where everybody wears the same gray felt jumpsuits with high collars. I'm like, in what reality are we all dressing the same? Like human beings, I don't feel like are ever going to.
It's so mundane. I know. Yeah. It gives me a lot of anxiety to watch those films. We actually at Idea Couture where I work, we do a Futurists film club. So every month we kind of watch a movie as a team and pick it apart. Well, it's nice to be with your people when you do that,
Yeah,
and it's always
sure.
better with some alcohol,
Yeah.
if you know
Yeah,
what I
of course.
mean.
Well, actually,
Sure.
me and Casey want to do that for the podcast. Is like watch like sci-fi movies and then come on here and try to pick out like try to find some sort of issue like whether it be mega cities or the future of law enforcement, stuff like that, and try to
One
use
thing that
pop
always
culture
the thing that
as a
bothers me
vehicle.
most, the thing that bothers me most from science fiction is the first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. There was a crewman, a man wearing a skirt. That was never in any of the other episodes ever again. So it's like they were like, we're gonna break this ground, and then they were like, we were told to not do that. So they were like, it is
Too soon.
They were like, it is 1989. We cannot do that yet.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? Where was that? They haven't even done that in the movies, I don't think.
Yeah, according to Star Trek, in the future, everyone wears pants except for Whoopi Goldberg, which is kind of interesting. Yeah.
It's kind of how it is now. What? I don't know what that means.
But yeah, that was a very fun tangent I took us on. But I wanted to ask you about workforce automation. So I know the future of entrepreneurship, the future of jobs, and even the workplace, as we discussed, in terms of providing a space for a family to operate and still everyone kind of self-actualize in these spaces. But in terms of workforce automation, did you get a sense that this was discussed frequently with the people you talk to, and what's your own kind of perspective on the phenomenon of quote robots taking our jobs?
A lot to unpack there.
Okay.
That's my first, but where it came out in the interviews is I think when we talked about care and economics, I think that's a big place where we can think about automation. One of the people I didn't get a chance to interview, but I thought would be really interesting is Sherry Turkle, and she writes. Are you guys familiar with her?
I'm not familiar
Yeah.
with Sherry Turkle. No.
So Sherry Turkle, she's a social scientist. She works for MIT, and she wrote a book called Alone Together. That's probably her most famous text, and a lot of books since. And basically, she talks about the experience of technology and connectedness. And we have this choice. There's this tension between what we automate and what we don't automate, or where we implement technology and where we don't implement technology. And what I think is particularly interesting is the reason we're talking so much about automation is because it's disproportionately affected the lives of white middle class or working men. And when we look ahead, where I think it's really interesting is to look about or look where it impacts or might impact women. And I think when we look at the care economy, that's where we really have to consider why and how we're using automation, robotics, AI, all of those things. And Sherry in her work, she talks about the choice we have of where we actually use this technology versus where we don't. And as in everything that can be automated, it's almost as if we have this choice as to whether robotics and AI will replace care workers or whether they'll augment what they're doing. And I feel a particular way about that. So I would say that that's the first point. Is I think it's super important to have a conversation as a society. I know that's a little harder to do now just because of the cultural climate or the political climate, but to have a conversation around what we want to automate and why, where does it make sense? We have a choice in all of this. And then thinking more broadly into some of our interviews, I remember Sarah Maker. This isn't in the publication, but she had this one line that's really stuck with me. And she talks about how people are so against technology or technological innovation until it's there and they see the good. And she had this line. that breaking the backs of millions of women in exchange for not having automation seems like a horrible proposition to me, is what she said. So I think when we think about automation, it's really about where it makes sense and how to plug it into the types of contexts where people need it the most. But that's problematic just given how we think about automation today, automation being used to drive the enterprise and drive the bottom line revenue. All of that is how we start to use it in a more human centered way. And maybe that sounds a little bit Pollyanna, but my particular view.
No, me, Adam and I often talk about it in the context of, first of all, eliminating labor, and obviously it would still be running industries, but we also usually talk about in the context of it facilitating eventually a post-capital society, because we're dirty communists. And we've never made any bones about it.
I know
to us, it doesn't sound Pollyanna-ish at all.
No, not at all. Because and we've also talked about, in terms of like care, certainly related to care. Like, of course, technology could greatly augment teachers and have an impact on education. But I think education is something we'd always want, like humans, and that to be kind of a process that involves people. It would be odd to like send your kid to get someone to get taught history by a robot. You know what I mean? So, and at the same point,
for human history teachers.
Yeah. But I will say,
unselfish way.
I never considered it, but now that you mention it, the thing that most people are afraid of right now is self-driving trucks, and that millions of self-driving trucks, and that just as you said, that's particularly a concern for working class white males, it kind of makes me.
And I challenge your listeners a little bit in the sense that these jobs are being eliminated, and they will become eliminated as autonomous vehicles become more and more mainstream. And maybe that's not a bad thing in this case, given what the safety and things like that. But on the other hand, are these men willing to kind of consider alternatives? And I'm targeting like white men right now, but I think it's more broad.
Oh no, they need some targeting. That's what they need right now.
Yeah,
that's absolutely.
I'm allowed to do that today. After last week. But are they willing to go back and look at how they can impact industries like education or like health? And if those are the places we really want high touch, how do we start to shift their mental model and empower these individuals to go back, get type of education and training to add value in those types of high touch contact?
No, that's really interesting, because a lot of the conversations that we've had about automation, typically people think about, I know we prefer to think of it like if when as automation increases, we'll have more free time to like express ourselves and self-actualize in one way or another. But a lot of ways, without some sort of structure, whether it be, a mandated shorter work week or a basic income or whatever, there's this notion that most people have been displaced as people lost employment in manufacturing sectors. They ended up in the service sector. And I always found certain aspects of what we think of as the service sector to be in some sense dehumanizing. Like when you have like Postmates and you have someone bring it to you, and there's these stories like, someone's like, leave that outside my door, I don't actually want to see you, which seems incredibly dehumanizing. But I never thought of kind of the service economy having that care component. And that could be, because I think we're all in agreement that should be obviously more human. Yeah, no, there's a lot to think about there.
Because when we talk about the next economy, I think what comes up in more positive views of the future is this idea that we're going to have more free time for leisure and art and creation and all these things, which seems great. And I think we hope to have some of that time. But I think if we shift that to also this area of meaning and purpose, which is care, I'm curious to see how that changes things. And I'm also, this is a tangent, but it's one of my favorite lines from The Future According to Women. Adrienne Marie Brown in her Future Fantasy, she talks about, she kind of just asks a question, and the question is, what if everyone had the experience of what it's like to give birth and like have that really deep connection?
Right.
It's super interesting. Would that change the way we think about care and,
Right.
and what we value and things like that? I don't know, but something to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess yeah, so related to automation, did any of the people you talked to, and again, of course, how you think of it as well, the notion of a universal basic income is almost at this point kind of tied to the hip when people talk about automation. And I'm wondering, I think it's something that me and Casey have talked about a lot. I'm conflicted on some aspects of basic income, but I'm wondering if you got any sense from the people you talked to during this initiative, and of course, what you think about the universal basic income idea.
So this didn't come up in any of our conversations in this way. I mean, I think there are certain things that are close, but an interesting space. I think where I kind of go with this question is the idea of basic income, basic minimum income is going back to care. We don't even value things like childcare or caregiving, either for children or those who are older in the population. So for me, it's kind of solving that before we think about some of the other types of programs we put in place. Like when we have actually, I was about to go on a political rant, but I'm not going to.
I won't discourage you, but if you don't want to, you don't have to. I do no, but that's one of the reasons that I'm becoming more convinced that basic income is a good idea, even without the prospect of technological unemployment and automation, because there's so much work in our economy that isn't productive in the sense that you get a paycheck for it, like caring for children, caring for people who are infirmed and things like that. That and just in a sense of raising the floor and broadening the scope of opportunity, I think. But yeah, that's exactly how I normally think of it in terms of value caregivers in a sense that they, like, if you spend your full waking hours as a caregiver, it's very well possible that you spend your full waking hours not having any income at all.
Yeah. Care is unpaid work, and it falls disproportionately onto women. There's also a piece by Melinda Gates. I don't know if you guys would have read it this year. Her and Bill put out their annual letter, and their 2016 piece was called something, Two Superpowers We Wish We Had. And it tackles the idea of unpaid work and how that falls to women and girls, and what it means to actually think about recognizing their contribution and then starting to do two things. One is reducing the amount of unpaid work that they're doing, so using technological interventions to actually reduce that. And the other is redistributing work. So I think about, again, the type of underemployment we have is men who aren't necessarily in the jobs that they once had. What are they doing with their other time? How are they contributing to a household? And how does that dynamic start to shift?
So I guess kind of, this is somewhat of a broad question, but I'm out of the questions that I plan to ask, but I'm wondering for our audience and for me and Casey here, I'm wondering, are there other resources beyond Misc Magazine that we could follow to kind of ensure that we're kind of continuously being exposed to a more diverse range of voices beyond Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil and etc.?
I love that question. I think the first is in The Future According to Women. In the text, there are 40 plus women that you can follow on social media. That's a good first starting point. On Twitter, there are some lists of futurists that are women, and I think a few other lists as well to follow. There was a really big blow up in the professional foresight community last year. A woman, you may know her podcast, her name's Rose Eveleth. and she runs the Future Forward podcast. She wrote a piece, Why Are There No Women Futurists in the Atlantic? And it blew up because there are a lot of women who are futurists. But again, going back to what we mentioned earlier, there's a difference between being a professional futurist and someone who thinks about the future and is very vocal. So she wrote this piece, and there was a lot of backlash in the foresight community. And as a result, there were all these lists published and like resources. If you want to connect with more women who are futurists, here's where to go.
I guess that's something that I always have trepidation with, because I feel like it would be very offensive to have you on here and be like, Emily, why are no women working on the future? Because I know that it's because I don't know them doesn't mean that they're not out there. So.
Right, so we always have to remind ourselves that the answer is the question is why don't we hear a lot about women working on the future?
I think it's a good rephrasing of the question, and there's a ton of I shouldn't say a ton, but there's a growing number of women who are futurists. There's a growing number of minorities who are practicing foresight. There's still a long way to go. I'm not going to lie to you. But it's at least improving.
I think in a lot of space in because I work in think tanks and have worked in several think tanks. I think it's a problem kind of industry wide in terms of intellectual work in general, and it's something that I think people are becoming more conscious of. But there's just so much further to go. But Emily, it was great having you on today. I had a great time talking with you. I hope we can have you on again in the future and discuss. Maybe something from your movie club.
We'll have to do a podcast with the Idea Couture Futures team.
Sure,
you'll lose your mind. Thank you guys for having me. I had a great time.
Absolutely, so did I.
All right, well that'll do it for us this week on Future Left Podcast. We'll see you next time. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.